Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar around the future of the contact center. As the subtitle says, it's happening now, but don't stress out, and we'll tell you why soon. Before we get started, though, let me do a brief introduction of myself. My name is Tom Lewis. I'm the CEO of Smart Action. However, most of this presentation is really going to rely on my 28 years of customer experience, call center background, consulting for a number of Fortune 1000 companies as part of my role as a partner for Deloitte for 13 years and leading that practice. And most of my efforts have been really on helping organizations improve customer-facing operations. For today's agenda, we're going to go through a number of things. First, just sort of do a initial assessment of the marketplace. What's the present contact center environment look like? Some of the questions you might have around dealing with the future of the call center, as well as omni-channel and lots of other buzzwords that might be relevant to your current conversations. We'll take a little bit of a short-term view as well as a long-term view, and then some ideas around what you can do now to start and prepare for the changes and how to think about those changes. To get started, let's talk about some of the challenges that face typical call centers today. On this study, as you'll notice from the Contact Center Challenges and Priorities report that was part of Contact Center Pipeline, there are a number of challenges that are facing the call center customer service world. Most of these, if you'll notice, sort of revolve around the quality and character and so forth of the human element, the call center agent, getting call center agents in domestically in particular to do the job that was always part of the whole operation, as it were, is becoming more and more difficult. Retaining them is hard. Finding the ones that will work for the salary is hard. And so the challenge, and maybe this is just something that is obvious, is that trying to figure out how to balance that supply of human resources with all the other challenges that face you in the contact center around introducing automation and meeting your customers where they are in terms of the channel that they want to interact with you most of all. How did we get here? Well, back in the late 90s, when the internet was getting a lot of traction, a lot of people thought that voice would be dead soon. And by voice, I mean call center operations. And the reason was simply that people would put their self-service capabilities on the web, and people would use them, and they wouldn't call in. And as we all know, over the last 15 plus years, that has not been the case. In fact, call volumes have actually increased, and the reason for that was not immediately apparent to everybody, but the more intimate you are with your customer base, the more ability you give them to know more and more about your operation, the more they're going to want to know, and more questions they have, and so forth. So that didn't happen, and call volumes continued to increase, and still are increasing to this day. But as the channels have expanded, so did the customer needs. So we started from the internet, and now have since expanded to just standard self-service, to chat, to Facebook, to SMS, to voice self-service capabilities. And customers became more informed due to that availability of all those different channels and all that information that was out on the website. But the opposite of what was expected occurred, in that every time that you increased those channels, that also increased the connectivity with the clients. In fact, one way I like to think about this is it's a galaxy or a universe, and the universe contains all of these different channels. But don't think of it in terms of one channel cannibalizing another. In fact, think of it as the universe continues to expand, and that the more channels that you have, to some degree, the more connections you have with your customer base. Now, that's not 100% true. A current example, I think, is that, for example, most organizations don't deal with fax anymore. Okay? And recently I've been at a number of trade shows where people are talking about discontinuing the use of email. And the reason for the discontinuing of the use of email is because people are on a sort of a demand basis, and what often ends up happening is somebody will send an email, and then if they don't get a response in a fairly reasonable amount of time, they will tend to use one of the other channels, creating double the amount of work for the call center. And so some call centers are actually considering disbanding or stop using of email and forcing them down these other channels. Now, as the new channels have increased, the agent component hasn't become any easier. And part of the reason for that is that although the technology has been out for quite a while to allow for this true multi-channel, omni-channel platform, the human element is still an interesting challenge, because just because you're a good call center agent doesn't mean that you're good at writing responses on chat windows or emails or anything along those lines. And being able to, as a call center manager, manage the balance between moving your resources from one channel to the other based on the influx of that particular channel's volume also creates some interesting challenges for call center operations managers. And so that challenge means that you know about these other channels, you want to provide them and meet where the customer is, but even if you have them in-house, sometimes that can be difficult to deliver on. And if for no other reason, then it also can be very difficult to deliver the same answer and the same quality of service through each of those different channels that you're considering. So this evolution of the technology is intriguing. I think initially everybody's response is, well, I have to do all of these channels all at once. And the reality is that it's probably not the case. In fact, one of our favorite analysts used to say, or has said, that you're only as good as your weakest channel. And what's interesting is, as people start to invest in these other channels to meet their customer, they're creating a deficit, essentially, in terms of the investment that they're putting into the voice and the call center channel. And that creates for more problems. And so I guess my point is that I see the investment in these other channels is a good thing, but not to do that at the expense of poor customer service in your voice channel, and certainly without regard for making sure that the information provided in one channel is as accurate and consistent to another channel. So humans are busy, and I think that everyone is looking for the fastest way to resolve their issues. In fact, if you have read The Effortless Experience from Matt Dixon, you will know that, and this is the way I tend to phrase it, is customers choose the channel they choose to interact with you based on whichever one they think is going to take the least amount of effort to get done. And so if picking up the phone and calling is going to be easiest, great, then that's what they're going to do. If sending an email is the easiest, or sending a text or chatting online, then that's the channel that they're going to choose to use. And the fact is that all of these channels are probably around for a while now. Granted, maybe some new ones that we haven't contemplated yet. I think, when you consider like Facebook Messenger and some of the impacts that might have on your organization, I think that's an interesting additional channel. What is interesting about that, though, is that as channels become voice or text enabled, that the actual channel, the platform that they're going through, doesn't necessarily need to be entirely different. And so, for example, if you're texting, the agent may be using a ubiquitous platform where they're responding to text, they're responding to Facebook Message, and they're responding to all these different things on this ubiquitous platform. But what the customer wants most of all is this personalized experience. I often tell the story about how, if you've seen the movie Finding Nemo, that Dory, one of the fish in the movie, every time she met you was the first time that she's ever met you, and it sort of repeated that sequence over and over again. Well, if you think about it, IVRs and systems that are support-oriented, if they're not designed to incorporate your customer-specific needs and interpret them and in fact anticipate them, then very often you'll end up in a situation where it's like Dory from Finding Nemo and the IVR says, "How can I help you?" Well, adding that personalization is a key component to the design of any self-service channel. So if you know, for example, that a payment was just made, or you know that you just emailed them explanation of benefits or an invoice or an order was just submitted, then factor that in terms of what that customer may be looking for. In the voice channel, you might say, are you calling about that payment you made this morning or an hour ago or what have you? And that will tend to increase the utility of the voice self-service platform, because people aren't expecting that, because good customer service is hard to come by. And so if you've got a voice self-service platform where the system is anticipating and actually gets it right, then chances are that that caller is going to continue to try to engage with the system until it doesn't do that. And so hopefully if your answer is yes, then it'll go down the right path. And if your answer is no, it'll simply say, okay, how can I help you? The other thing is that you don't need to offer all the channels, and you need to make sure that they work effectively. But here's another thing. A lot of people still are of the belief that customer service should be handled 100% by humans. And there's an interesting dynamic to this. There are certain situations where a voice call shouldn't be handled by automation. And a couple of examples would be any call that requires empathy or compassion or persuasion or a ton of critical thinking, although there's probably getting less and less limits on that in the technology of late. But relative to compassion and empathy, the example I use is that you probably don't want automation used in a self-service application for the first notice of loss on a life policy. It's not probably the right way to express that compassion. And from a persuasion standpoint, a lot of automation isn't particularly good at that either. It's very good at order taking, but not necessarily the persuasion element of it. The objective through whatever channels that you do clearly should be that they're delivered in a sort of similar fashion, so that the experience and the answer, more importantly, is consistent from channel to channel. But on a longer term basis, I think what you'll find is that in the voice channel in particular, that speech recognition, artificial intelligence, and machine learning and all these other capabilities are making it so that consumers are getting more and more familiar and accustomed, and in fact starting to like, dealing with self-service in a voice channel. One way to think about it is that the voice is probably the best human-to-machine interface, if only the machine could understand. And we're finally getting to the point now where the technology has enabled the machine to understand. And so now it's incumbent upon organizations to design it with that personalization and to have the flexibility to deal with the fact that the caller is probably more used to dealing with voice, whether that's through Siri or Cortana or the Amazon Echo, which is a very interesting introduction into this whole field that is really starting to play into people's perception in terms of the way voice can be used. Now, here's an interesting little side note. When you think about Siri, and when you think about Cortana, and you think about the Amazon Echo, all of them benefit from the fact that they are in high fidelity audio. And strangely enough, it might surprise you, but the telephone system in the U.S. is not high fidelity. And in fact, unless you're on like a Sprint phone talking to a Sprint user, you don't have a high fidelity connection. You're calling a call center, you're going through a low 8 kilohertz connection. And the reason that's important is because that's one of the reasons why technology has to adjust for the quality of the speaker voice, and so that you can hear and the system can hear accurately. And it's sometimes why simple things like yes and no are not heard properly by automation. Now, things are getting better to compensate for that, and eventually the telephony infrastructure will get upgraded, but that might take a little while. But what will happen inside the call center is that the roles are going to change more and more as automation takes over through whatever channel. That the automation in the call center will allow for, require call center agents and managers and supervisors to become more information workers. And it means that they will be analyzing the way in which consumers are using that automation, and to be constantly tuning and updating it to allow for improvements. So for example, if somebody is trying to identify themselves and they don't have the account number, what are some other ways they could identify themselves? And then by analyzing that and how people respond to that, you can constantly, in an iterative way, improve the access to their account. So you could say, well, they don't have their account number, but they have their phone number. And this seems pretty logical, but what I'm getting at is on every element of a particular call flow or transaction or what have you, is that you'll be monitoring that to make it a very effortless experience regardless of the channel. Well, technology is going to continue to expand and improve. One of the complications is that historically call centers have gone through these waves of improvement, probably not as fast as some of the more operationally critical elements of an enterprise. And so therefore, there is a lot more technology available to call centers that is in the cloud. And the advantage of that, of course, is there's a multitude of things, but the idea is instead of having these constant platform improvements over time, the improvements come as part of the license agreements on an annual or whatever basis. I also do believe that with this introduction or expansion of self-service, that in about 2020 or so will be the first time that the overall North American call center agent population will start to decline. And I think this is pretty consistent with what the Bureau of Labor Statistics is starting to see as well, is that they continue to rise, and then we're going to start to hit a little bit of a plateau and then a tapering off. I don't know how fast that tapering off is going to be because, as I mentioned, there's lots of reasons still to have call center agents. I want to get back to a point that I was making earlier around the assumption that you should have live agents in your call center. So my view is that if you want somebody to talk to a live agent, they should be able to do that. And I talked about empathy and compassion, all those kind of things. But the other factor is that you can't make the assumption that all your customers want to talk to a live person. And so therefore, the key is, instead of thinking of we're going to push everybody to automation or we're going to push everybody to talk to a live agent, is that really what's most important is giving your customers the choice to interact with you through the channel that they choose. Again, the one that they perceive is going to take the least amount of effort to get the task done. Now, I've seen a lot over the years in the call center space, and the fact is that while the pace of introduction of technology is picking up, a lot of these changes aren't going to happen overnight. And while your organization may have one channel or two channels or what have you, whatever the setup is, the fact is that to the extent that you provide those channels effectively and with effortless experience, that's what's going to be more important than anything else. So moving on, what does this all mean? Well, I think the technology is going to evolve on its own to some degree. I think that it's not going to happen overnight, and that you have some opportunity to set the seeds, plant the seeds for how you're going to improve the operation, provided that for most organizations, the number one priority is improving that customer experience, because what several of the recessions have taught us is that the organizations that really focus on customer experience, customer retention, are the ones that survive in the downturn. So given those particular foci, then that's where I think everything should be concentrated. Now, by preparing for the future, I think the number one thing that you can do today to prepare for an environment where you achieve a lot of the elements that I was talking about around personalization and meeting the customer where they are and the different channels and so forth, is the availability of data. Today, often the ERP systems, CRM systems have quite a lot of data, but it's not always the case that you can get that data out of the system. And some of the systems are antiquated, but they do the job today. And the problem is that getting the data out so that you can introduce self-service and you can, frankly, make it a less effort for even your call center agents. That data integration piece is a challenge. And if you don't have a replatforming in the near future or new systems coming on board, then starting to plant the seeds of, hey, we need to expose the data around that is probably the single most important thing you can do. And if you do have a replatforming coming your way, then making sure that new system is designed in phase 1, not phase 5 or never, to allow for that data to be involved. So let's talk about preparing for the future. I just highlighted the whole notion of involving the IT department, so I think that's a key piece of it. We're going to need to adjust agent training to be more information workers and adjust the way that we're dealing with customer service, and really this will continue to be a challenge. The idea is if you can introduce more self-service, therefore reduce the need for call center agents, which will be part of the trend in the next 4 or 5 years, then you're going to end up in a scenario where you can have those agents spend the right amount of time to get the right service for those customers that do pass through and want to talk live. Investing in the right channels, I think, if you try to do everything in all channels, that's probably going to be very, A, stressful, and B, probably not necessarily going to be successful in all of those different channels. I think going cloud is important because the enhancements and the perfection of particular capabilities is going to be far greater from a vendor who focuses on enabling those kind of technologies as opposed to having to wait on these 4, 5, and 10-year replatforming schedules. From an intelligent self-service standpoint, making sure that you're using things that have the artificial intelligence component to it, that are more than just simple rote what's my order, or order status, or make a payment, or what have you, but getting into complexities, that complex transactions that are more complex but repeatable. If every single call is a snowflake, obviously that's more difficult, but to the extent that just because it's complicated isn't in itself a reason not to introduce automation, because as long as there's business rules and a process associated with it, then it might be perfectly fine. And finally, I definitely believe that customer experience focus is going to continue to be the main thing that needs to drive the behavior here. While cost reduction is important, customer experience is number one. And very often what I say to people is that are evaluating various technology is any vendor that comes into this space should come to the table with a solution that provides for cost reduction and improved customer experience and something else. Those two things are, frankly, at this point in this space, table stakes. And that probably doesn't surprise anybody listening. So let's remember these three things. This is sort of the wrap-up slide. Data availability, I believe, is going to be the number one channel, continues to be. It's going to be the thing that's going to really enable the personalization and the ability to deploy true omni-channel solutions. I believe voice is here to stay. In fact, some aspects of voice may actually improve because of the technology that's being introduced by companies like SmartAction. And finally, it's a journey, not a destination. And maybe this is a little cliche-ish, but what I'm getting at is that you can incrementally improve. So if you're introducing automation in one channel, you don't have to introduce everything. If you've got an agile approach and you're introducing one component after another, then anticipate that transformation can occur incrementally. So hopefully that was entertaining and informative, and thank you very much. If you want to hear more information about these concepts and, frankly, the ability to use voice self-service with artificial intelligence, visit us at smartaction.com. Thanks.